All right, everybody. I'm Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon, The Blackest Heart, and The Lonesome Crown, all published by Simon & Schuster's Saga Press. Today, I'm going to review The Great Hunt, book number 2 in Robert Jordan's spectacular Wheel of Time series. Now, this book came out in 1990. I'm one of the fortunate ones that got to read these books. I'm old enough that I bought Wheel of Time, Book 1, Eye of the World, in 1989 when it first came out. I read it, loved it, eagerly anticipated Book 2, bought it in 1990 when it came out, read it, loved it, eagerly anticipated Book 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way through. I've been reading these yearly almost my whole life. When Book 2 came out, and I was stoked, super stoked, waited for it. You know, when we review these books, we always review the covers. So let's go through these covers. Let's talk about the original cover. Here's my original hardback that I bought back in the day. The original Daryl K. Sweet cover that everyone's familiar with. This looks like it came straight out, this looks like it was trotted straight out of the 1980s, how to design a fantasy book guide for dummies. But I love it. Daryl K. Sweet's paintings are always, I think he's a great, masterful painting. I love the font. I love the font that they were using. I just love the overall packaging of these. A lot of people don't. I thought they were great and charming. Then they've redone them with these other graphics, and I've got both sets. I've got both sets full. I've got both hardcovers, original hardcovers, plus these redone ones. Now this illustration was done by someone named and I apologize for butchering this name because I will. Kikai Kotaki, an illustrator named Kikai Kotaki. That's a really snazzy illustration. I love that illustration. They're very great paintings of the Trollocs and the someone with the Horn of Valere. I mean, it's similar. This one has Trollocs lurking in the background. This one has Trollocs lurking in the background, as you can see. This one has Trollocs lurking in the foreground. The Horn of Valere is in the foreground here. The Horn of Valere is in the background here. Great juxtaposition. I really like both illustrations. However, we always pick a favorite. I think you're going to find out that mostly my favorites are going to lean towards the old Daryl K. Sweet illustrations. Although these are great. I still like the old ones just because of nostalgia, and I'm an old man. I could say I'm a young man with an old soul, but I'm an old man with an old soul. There we go. Covers covered. Let's get back to the book. Prologue in this thing is dynamite. I love the myrtle, the description of the myrtle. Oh, I gotta read it because just Robert Jordan's writing is so great. I love Robert Jordan's writing style. And when the myrtle, in the prologue, when the myrtles step on scene, I love this description. Writing advice, folks, if you want to learn how to write epic fantasy, study everything Robert Jordan did in these books. If you watched my review of Eye of the World, I gave a lot of writing advice and I pointed out specifics, and I'm going to do the same here. But listen to this. A myrtle stepped between them, and they fell to their knees. The Trollocs fell to their knees. It was garbed in black that made the Trollocs' chainmail and their human masks seem bright. Garments that hung still without a ripple as it moved with a viper's grace. The man who called himself Bors felt his lips drawing back over his teeth, half snarl and half not. He was shamed to admit even to himself fear. It had its face uncovered, its pasty pale face, a man's face, but eyeless as an egg, like a maggot in a grave. The smooth white face swiveled, regarding them all, one by one it seemed. A visible shiver ran through them under that eyeless look. Now, I read that terribly. If you want to read it yourself or have Michael Kramer read it to you on Audible, they do a much better job. But that is a fantastic description of one of the creepier creatures that shows up in these books. And right from the get-go, we get that description. Sorry I butchered the reading, I should practice this shit before I try it. We'll edit it out and edit a better reading in there. How about that? The problem solved. Now you can really feel, and in chapter 1 is called, as the title of chapter 1 is The Flame of Tar-Valon. Great opening chapter. Just such a great opening chapter for a second novel, because there's this scene in there where Lan and Rand are practicing their sword fighting and having a discussion. And throughout that discussion, then the discussion makes sense in every way, but throughout that discussion, we get a recap of what happened in the Eye of the World. And I just was like, that's the most brilliant way I've ever seen a writer choose to recap what happened in the previous book and have it all make sense and have it all be just riveting. So if you want to learn how to recap, if you're into big epic fantasy and you've written one book and you're starting book number 2 and you're trying to figure out, well, how can I familiarize my reader with everything that happened in book 1, just study chapter 1, The Flame of Tar-Valon, in this book, because it sets up some great, great stuff. And it gives you a refresher course on what happened in book 1. Not only that, but one of the things that Rand says in that chapter, which stuck with me throughout the entire series, was he says, Moraine, he's complaining, he's kind of whinging a little bit to Lan about things. He's kind of complaining. And he says, Moraine, I don't know if I particularly like her because, she keeps, she keeps telling me that I'm gonna go mad and then I'm gonna die. That's the only, she doesn't give me any hope that anything is gonna turn out good, but that I am just gonna go mad and I'm gonna die with this magic that's in my body. And that stuck with me throughout the whole series is, who wouldn't be freaked out by that, especially if the supernatural things around you seem real and you can feel it in your bones and you're fighting it in your mind, It always stuck, that line always stuck with me. Great line, great opening chapter, And then later on, Swan Sanche, I think that's her name, she rolls through the story and she lets Rand know that, yes, it is confirmed you are the Dragon Reborn. So all that anxiety that you now feel, just go ahead and we'll just ramp that up and then go on our merry way. So deal with that. That just happened. Have fun. You're going to go mad and then you're going to die. Later, dude. So then, this is kind of the way it felt. And then Rand and Perrin and Matt, they go south on their own mission. We're going to not do too many spoilers, but we're going to talk a little spoilery stuff in these, because with a 14-book series, spoilers are going to happen when you're in the middle of reviewing book 4, 5, and 6, you're going to be ended up spoiling stuff. So anyway, Rand and Matt, so spoiler warning here, some things might be spoiled. So if you don't want to continue with the video, that's cool. If you'd rather read the books and not. But if you're a reader of the books, if you're watching this review and you've already read the book, I'm being incredibly redundant here. So anyway, Rand, Perrin, and Matt, they go on an adventure with Ingtar and Huron down south for the Horn of Valir or something like that. Egwene Nynaeve, and they follow Moraine up to Tar-Valon to do their Aes Sedai training. And a lot of the plot threads that are prevalent throughout the entire series are basically, most of them are set up in this book. There are a lot of stuff that goes on in the further books that's set up in The Great Hunt. And so that's why it's one of the more important books in the series. I don't know if it's one of my favorite books in the series. I know it's a lot of people's favorite book. I think if I were to rank this in 1 through 14, it would probably fall between 4 and maybe 6. Somewhere in there. Maybe I'll do, when I've reread and reviewed all of the books, I'll do a final ranking of all the books, how I think they kind of fall into place. But as of now, it's not my favorite. It's certainly not my favorite. It's certainly not my least favorite, but it's probably one of my upper tier ones. Just because it sets up, this is the book that sets up the rest of this is the book that sets up all the plot threads, or most of the plot threads that we need to pay attention to for the rest of the series. And I think that once I read this, when I read this in 1990 when it first came out, I didn't know how long the series was going to be. I just assumed it would be a trilogy. And then I got to the end of This Great Hunt, book 2, and I realized, you know what? This is going to take more than a trilogy to finish. This might be a very long series, This was competing next to, at the time, this was the big fantasy series I was reading, along with Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, which is up here. There it is. Those were the two big fantasy series I was sort of reading at the time, and I could tell that Tad Williams was probably going to wrap his up. His story was probably going to be wrapped up in a trilogy, whereas The Wheel of Time was actually growing and growing and growing bigger and bigger by the end of book 2. By the end of book 2 in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, we could see the end on the horizon. This one, we were like, I don't even see the horizon yet. I don't see the end. I don't see the horizon yet. I don't think we're even, are we there yet? Are we there yet? No, I don't think we're even out of the parking lot. That's what I was thinking, And I was right, because 12 books or 13 books later, the story was still a-going. But it got me excited I was like, okay, this is exciting, because I think this might be a gigantic series that I might be following for years. And I was correct. There was a few other things I wanted to talk about. Chapter 20, about 2/3 of the way through the book, chapter 27 calls What Might Be, was one of my favorite chapters, because it really kind of throws our character Rand into sort of an alternate universe where he's dreaming or his mind is playing tricks on him, and he's starting to see alternate universe versions of himself. Like, what would have happened had I not gone on this quest? What would have happened if I just stayed at home? And then his mind plays tricks on him where he starts to see alternate versions of himself if he had made this decision. We all know about the multiverse, where every decision, like, we're all living in the multiverse, right? People, where there's millions and millions of versions of ourselves out in the world. Like, in some of those versions, I'm not this guy right now. Maybe I'm in prison. Maybe I became president of the United States. Maybe I was married to Scarlett Johansson. In that universe, just let me apologize to Scarlett Johansson right now. I am sorry I am such a lame husband. In that universe. Who would want to be married to this? Especially if you're Scarlett Johansson. But in some universe out there, it's a reality. And Rand has to face some of those, like, what ifs. And I really enjoyed that chapter. It's about 2/3 of the way through. I thought it was great. And then other scenes that I thought the Celine and Rand relationship was fantastic. I think that sets up, if you go back, if you know how these books end, and then you go back and you reread The Great Hunt, and you see that Celine and Rand relationship form, and how it morphs over time, and how she manipulates. When you first read it, you don't realize what's happening, but then when you reread it in retrospect, knowing how things end, those conversations and the things that happen between Rand and Serene actually hold weight over the story. And then you reread those interactions with a new eye, with an all-knowing eye, and you're like, oh man, Robert Jordan really was setting stuff up, and he paid it off in spades at the end. And then another thing that I loved about The Great Hunt is we get to learn more about Perrin. Perrin's adventure with the wolves, and his wolf sight, and his wolf power. And, Perrin becomes a lot of people's favorite character after book 2, because we spend a lot of time with him and the wolves. And, and then in book 3, which I'm going to reread soon, I just remember his little girlfriend that shows up. And, Perrin ended up being one of my favorite. Rand was always my favorite. I think Perrin and Matt kind of tied. You know, I think that with each book, one of them kind of rose a little above the other, you know, depending on who got more screen time and stuff. I think that Perrin and Matt are a little bit tied for me as far as, but I loved Egwene, and Egwene was always one of my favorites. I love Egwene much more so than Nynaeve, even though Nynaeve and the Lan, and you start to get hints of the Nynaeve and the Lan relationship here, and then but Egwene when she is in the dungeon with Patty and Fane was one of the more gripping scenes that I've read in a fantasy book ever. I mean, that just had me glued, because Patty and Fane, he's not our main big bad. He's more of like the worm tongue to our main big bad. You know, our main big bad, kind of like the Sauron of this universe, is never really present. He's just sort of a looming threat, much like Sauron was in Lord of the Rings. But Patty and Fane gets to come down and be the main baddie, to sort of represent the main baddie, if that makes sense. And there's a point in time when he's thrust into a situation alone with one of our main characters, Egwene, towards the end of this book, and I was just riveted by that scene. Just absolutely 100% spectacular writing, spectacular dialogue, just great. And so this whole book, The Great Hunt, book number 2, such a super setup. So book 1 was sort of a setup of the world and our characters, where we just get to know them. Book 2 is really a super setup for the plot threads that we're going to follow through the rest of the series. And it's just great. You know that I love these books. You know that I love these books, and none of them are going to get really bad. Well, I take that back. Books 8, 9, 10, 11. I mean, there's a handful of books that I'm just going to be like, folks, you could probably skip these and be all right. But not The Great Hunt. You cannot skip this. And these are not books that you should read out of order. These are books that you need to read in sequence. Otherwise, because if you read this without having read Wheel of Time, you're going to be like, what's going on? So you got to read Wheel of Time, then you got to read The Great Hunt, and then you got to read the rest of them, because it is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, fantasy series on the planet. And Robert Jordan is a wonderful, wonderful writer. Oh my gosh, when I reread these, and when you know how things end, and then you reread it, it almost takes on a different... I mean, you're reading it differently now. When you read it the first time, you didn't know how it was going to end. But then when you read it and you know how it's going to end, you start to see how brilliant this guy was in setting things up. So I give this a solid... I mean, and the first handful of books in this series, for me, even though I didn't quite like it as much as Wheel of the Eye of the World, and I didn't quite like it as much as some of the other ones coming up, it's still, for me, a 10 out of 10. That's how great this book is. 10 out of 10. Even though it's probably going to rank somewhere between 4 and 7 in my overall ranking of the series, still a 10 out of 10.